European car makers are in reverse after Donald Trump announces 25% tariffs on auto imports beginning next week.
The European Union treats us very badly. They have for years. I saw that. I had it out with them in my first term. But European Union's been very tough.
European leaders are expected to discuss Donald Trump's latest tariff threats as they gather today in Brussels for a meeting on defense.
Donald Trump announced a fresh wave of tariffs, this time aimed directly at the European Union. For Brussels, this isn't just an economic nuisance. It's a full-scale challenge to Europe's economic independence. Billions of dollars in trade are now at risk. Entire industries are bracing for impact, and the long-standing US-EU alliance is suddenly on shaky ground. But Europe isn't staying silent. French President Emmanuel Macron is leading the charge, warning that if the US continues down this path, the EU must retaliate. His message? Europe cannot afford to be pushed around anymore. And he's not alone. Across the continent, leaders are debating how far they're willing to go. Will they negotiate? Will they retaliate? Or could this trigger an all-out trade war? Because this isn't just about tariffs, it's about power. It's about who sets the rules in global trade. It's about whether Europe remains a junior partner to Washington or finally charts its own course. And in the middle of it all, one looming question remains. Is this the moment when Europe finally breaks away from the US? Donald Trump's new tariffs on the European Union mark a sharp escalation in trade tensions, shaking transatlantic relations. After targeting Canada, Mexico, and China, the US is now setting its sights on Europe, and the UK isn't spared either. For years, Trump has criticized the EU's trade surplus, especially in automobiles and luxury goods. Now his administration is imposing tariffs on European cars, wines, cheeses, and agricultural products, arguing that unfair EU policies have hurt American businesses. The UK had hoped for a strong US trade deal post-Brexit, but instead it's facing the same tariffs as the EU. The EU now faces two choices: impose counter tariffs on US goods, hitting industries like tech and agriculture. Seek a diplomatic resolution, hoping to de-escalate tensions. However, another option looms: strengthening economic ties with China. If trade relations with the US collapse, Europe could pivot toward Beijing, reshaping global alliances. If Europe retaliates, we could see a full-blown trade war with massive consequences for global markets. The question now, will the EU fight back or back down? For years, European leaders have debated how much independence they should assert in global politics. But now, with Trump's latest tariff threats, Emmanuel Macron isn't holding back. The French president has taken a bold stance, one that could redefine Europe's role on the world stage. Speaking from the Élysée Palace, Macron made it clear the European Union can no longer afford to be economically dependent on the United States. He argued that if Washington insists on unilateral tariffs, Europe must be ready to respond, not just with countermeasures, but with a long-term strategy for economic and military autonomy. Europe can die. It can die, and this depends only on our choices, Macron warned in a speech at the Sorbonne. At the heart of Macron's argument is a simple but powerful idea. Europe must defend its own interests. This means strengthening key industries, reducing reliance on US markets, and investing heavily in defense. For years, Washington has pushed European nations, especially Germany and France, to increase their military budgets. But now, Macron is flipping the script. If the US continues using economic pressure as a weapon, he argues, Europe must take charge of its own security, not just as an ally of America, but as an independent power. Europe needs massive common funding for defense, Macron stated, advocating for investments amounting to hundreds of billions of euros. His speech wasn't just rhetoric, it came with action. Macron called for an EU-wide initiative to shield vital industries from American pressure, suggesting that European nations prioritize trade within the bloc and explore alternative partnerships, including China. This move is risky. While some see it as a necessary step towards European strength, others worry it could push the EU further away from its closest ally. Macron also emphasized the need for Europe to support its own defense industry, stating, "We must strengthen a European defense industrial and technological base to adapt to the new war economy." Germany, for instance, has been cautious. Chancellor Scholz supports EU unity, but remains wary of escalating tensions with the US. Meanwhile, Eastern European nations, traditionally more aligned with Washington, fear that breaking away too far could weaken NATO cohesion. But Macron is playing the long game. He's positioning France, and by extension, the EU, as a force that can stand on its own, whether in trade disputes or global security. The question is, will the rest of Europe follow his lead? As tensions between Washington and Brussels escalate, European leaders are faced with a critical decision: how to respond to Trump's aggressive trade policies while preserving EU unity. Macron's call for strategic autonomy has sparked a major debate across Europe, with nations weighing the risks of confrontation against the need for economic and military independence. Germany, Europe's economic powerhouse, has taken a measured stance. Chancellor Olaf Scholz has acknowledged the dangers of escalating tensions, but emphasized the need for a unified European front. We do not seek conflict, but we must protect our industries and workers. Europe's economic sovereignty is not negotiable, Scholz declared in Berlin. While Germany remains cautious about full-scale retaliation, it has signaled support for Macron's broader vision of reducing dependence on the U.S. market. Poland and the Baltic states, historically aligned with Washington, are in a tougher position. While they acknowledge the need for European unity, their primary concern remains security. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk stated, "We stand with our European partners, but let's be clear. NATO remains our cornerstone. Economic disagreements must not undermine our collective defense." This sentiment reflects a growing rift within the EU. How far can Europe push back against the US without jeopardizing transatlantic security ties? Meanwhile, Denmark and Finland have voiced support for targeted countermeasures against US tariffs, but stressed the importance of diplomatic solutions. Finnish Foreign Minister Elina Valtonen remarked, "Europe must be strong, but we must also be smart. Trade wars serve no one in the long run." These countries advocate for measured responses that deter U.S. economic pressure without escalating the situation into a full-blown economic conflict. Despite their differences, one thing is clear: Macron's push for a stronger, more independent Europe is gaining traction. The European Commission has already begun drafting potential counter-tariffs on key U.S. exports, including aircraft, technology, and agricultural goods. The message to Washington is simple. If the U.S. insists on unilateral economic warfare, Europe will not stand idly by. However, the real test lies ahead. Can the EU maintain a united front, or will internal divisions weaken its response? That question may determine the future of transatlantic relations for years to come. The relationship between the United States and France has always been complex, marked by moments of deep cooperation, but also sharp disagreements. While both nations have historically been allies, recent years have seen growing tensions, especially under the leadership of Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron. During Nicolas Sarkozy's presidency, France and the U.S. enjoyed a relatively strong partnership, particularly in counterterrorism efforts and NATO operations. But the dynamic began to shift with Trump's presidency in 2017. One of the earliest and most public fractures came when Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, a move that Macron harshly criticized. The French president responded with his now famous slogan, "Make our planet great again."
Make our planet great again. Thank you.
Directly challenging Trump's stance on climate policy. The friction didn't stop there. Macron repeatedly pushed for greater European strategic autonomy, something Trump viewed as an insult to NATO and American influence in Europe. Tensions escalated further when Trump mocked Macron's vision of a European army, calling it very insulting and suggesting that France should instead rely on the U.S. for security. Trade disputes also added fuel to the fire. In 2019, Trump threatened tariffs on French goods, including wine and luxury products, after France introduced a digital services tax targeting American tech giants like Google, Amazon, and Facebook. At the time, Trump dismissed Macron's economic policies, saying, "I've always said American wine is better than French wine." Beyond economic disputes, the two leaders clashed over global diplomacy. Macron was one of the strongest advocates for maintaining the Iran nuclear deal, after Trump unilaterally withdrew from it in 2018. He also criticized Trump's America First approach, arguing that it weakened Western alliances. Despite these tensions, both leaders have recognized the importance of U.S.-France cooperation in areas like counterterrorism, but their ideological rift remains. Now, with new tariffs looming, the question is whether this long-standing friction will push France further away from the U.S., or if economic necessity will force both nations to find common ground once again. In recent years, France has been steadily deepening its economic ties with China, a move that could gain even more significance if Trump's tariffs push the EU into a prolonged trade war with Washington. Macron has repeatedly emphasized the need for Europe to diversify its trade partnerships. Speaking at a recent business forum in Beijing, he stated, "Europe must not be a vassal of any superpower. Our economic partnerships must be balanced and open, with cooperation based on mutual respect." His remarks signaled a clear shift in France's approach. Rather than relying on the U.S. as its primary economic ally, France is actively strengthening its relationship with China. Trade figures tell the story. In the past 5 years, Sino-French trade has surged, with France exporting high-end luxury goods, aerospace technology, and agricultural products to China. Meanwhile, Chinese investment in France has grown, particularly in sectors like renewable energy and infrastructure. During Macron's last visit to China, both nations signed multi-billion-dollar deals covering aviation, nuclear energy, and agricultural exports, reinforcing their growing economic interdependence. However, this pivot is not without risks. Critics warn that increasing reliance on China could expose France to economic and political vulnerabilities, especially given Beijing's history of using trade as leverage in diplomatic disputes. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen acknowledged these concerns, stating, "Engagement with China must be strategic and clear-eyed. We welcome economic ties, but must safeguard our critical industries and values." At the same time, Washington is watching this development closely. The U.S. has long viewed China's growing influence in Europe with suspicion, fearing it could weaken Western unity. As tensions mount between the U.S. and Europe, the economic data reveals a shifting balance in France's global trade priorities. The long-standing commercial relationship between France and the U.S. faces mounting pressure, while trade with China continues its steady rise. For decades, the United States has been one of France's top trading partners. In 2024, France exported over $47 billion worth of goods to the U.S., with key sectors including aerospace, luxury goods, pharmaceuticals, and machinery. However, Trump's tariff policies threaten to disrupt this flow. The aerospace industry, led by Airbus, is particularly vulnerable. U.S. tariffs on European aircraft parts could make French exports less competitive, dealing a heavy blow to one of the country's most lucrative industries. Similarly, the French wine industry, a major export to the U.S., already faced tariffs under Trump's previous administration. If new duties are imposed, French winemakers could suffer even greater losses. Bilateral trade between the two nations exceeded $100 billion in 2024, with French exports to China growing at nearly 6% annually over the past decade. Luxury goods remain a dominant sector, with French fashion houses and wineries finding eager customers in China's growing middle class. But beyond consumer goods, aerospace and nuclear energy deals have played a crucial role in cementing economic ties. Airbus, for instance, signed a major agreement to expand production in Tianjin, solidifying China as one of its largest markets. Chinese President Xi Jinping highlighted the importance of this partnership during Macron's visit to Beijing. "France has been a key partner in our shared vision for economic cooperation. We look forward to expanding trade and investment in the years ahead." If Trump's tariffs hit key French industries, China could emerge as an even more vital trade partner. However, France faces a delicate balancing act, strengthening economic ties with Beijing without alienating its European allies or provoking further U.S. retaliation. The numbers are shifting, but the real question remains: will France continue to hedge its bets between the U.S. and China, or will economic necessity force a more decisive pivot toward the East? As tensions rise over Trump's tariffs, the EU faces two choices: confrontation or negotiation. Diplomacy remains the preferred path, but the window for a deal is narrowing. European leaders, led by Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, have called for urgent trade talks. A potential solution could involve targeted exemptions or a revised EU-US trade framework that addresses American concerns over subsidies and market access. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen warned, "We will not let Europe be bullied. We will respond proportionally to protect our industries." The worst-case outcome, a prolonged tariff war, could disrupt supply chains, raise consumer prices, and weaken both economies. With China actively courting European trade, prolonged US-EU disputes could accelerate Europe's pivot towards Beijing. The coming weeks will determine whether cooler heads prevail or if economic warfare becomes the new normal in transatlantic relations. The stakes couldn't be higher. Macron's push for European unity and economic independence signals a turning point in transatlantic relations. Will the EU rally behind his vision, strengthening internal trade and global partnerships? Or will Trump's tariffs expose deeper divisions, weakening the West's strategic cohesion? For now, Europe faces a critical choice: negotiate with Washington, retaliate with countermeasures, or forge new alliances, perhaps with China. Each path carries risks, from economic fallout to geopolitical realignment. As tensions escalate, businesses and consumers on both sides of the Atlantic will feel the impact.